about not terribly long before I met you, I was also working with a therapist, and after hearing my story, she said, "You seem lost," and that's exactly how I felt. And so to get from there to here, it was a journey, but the things that helped me were my wife, my family, my community, and reaching out to other people. One of the hallmarks of, if you want to call it religious trauma syndrome, and I happen to think that that's an apt title, that feeling of I've been through something that no one else has been through and nobody understands. Well, I'm here to tell you a lot of people have been through what you have, and they do understand, and they need you and you need them. I don't think I got through these things alone. I think of those Presbyterian ministers that I was a member of who told me, you didn't know the half of it. Actually, Calvary Temple was even worse than you know, and here's why, and here are facts that prove it. That helped me immensely to meet people who had been through trials and who could also help me. I didn't recover by myself. I wasn't alone, and you won't recover by yourself. You need friends. You need a group, you need therapy, and don't be ashamed of any of those things. You need those things, and they will help, and you will heal, even if it takes a long time.
That's Greg Lygon, a former member of Calvary Temple, a church in Sterling, Virginia that has spent more than a decade ensnared in scandals about emotional, sexual, and physical abuse, controlling members and alienating them from the rest of the world. I'm Jayson Blair, and this is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. Greg grew up in the late 1960s and early 1970s and came from a family that was involved in a Methodist church. After Greg moved to Northern Virginia as a teenager, the church faded into the background as he pursued other interests. In 1998, Greg was at work one day and had a book on philosophy on his desk when a colleague came up and asked what he was reading. That sparked a transformative conversation that led Greg to shift from his atheist views to embracing Christianity and attending a charismatic church called Calvary Temple that found its roots in the Assembly of God denomination. Greg attended the church from 1998 to 1998 when he was kicked out and told he was no longer welcome after he confessed to an affair with a married woman. In retrospect, Greg now says that it was a blessing because otherwise he would have never left the church. In 2008, the Washington Post published an investigative story on Calvary and its pastor, Star Scott Jr., who the paper described as a, quote, powerful and polarizing figure. The Post story revealed explosive allegations of control, abuse, trauma, and alienation of family and friends. Born in Monterey, California in 1947, Scott, a college football player, was raised in a home where they didn't practice religion, but he became born again in 1967. Scott gave up sports for religion and came to the Washington, D.C. area to become the head pastor of Herndon Assemblies of God. Eventually, he changed the name to Calvary Temple, and in 1986, Calvary left the Assemblies of God denomination and became independent. At that point, Scott began practicing his own form of theology that the Post described as a blend of evangelicalism and fundamentalism. The church started and stopped media ministries, opened more than 40 churches in East Africa, and several other U.S. cities, including Richmond. The Post article focused mainly on the fundamentalist religious beliefs, the control the church exerted over its members, and questionable financial practices that included requiring some members to tithe up to 20% of their income. By 2016, it had become apparent that there was much more going on at Calvary Temple. Allegations emerged that Scott, once right after his wife had died, preached a sermon. In that sermon, he said the book of Leviticus taught him that he was not allowed, as a high priest, to mourn the death of his wife, and instead he was to, quote, take a wife in her virginity. At the end of the sermon, he presented a 20-year-old candidate, and they married a week later. Another allegation emerged that two young women in the church had alleged that a member of church leadership had sexually abused them. But the cases were handled by the Loudoun County, Virginia Sheriff's Office and a deputy who was also a high-ranking member of the church. Nothing came out of the allegations, no charges were filed, and one of the victims, who was 14 at the time, was put out of the house by her family member in the church. She was dropped off at a gas station to wait for the father, who she had not lived with since she was 4 years old. Ex-members also reported that family members were forbidden from speaking with them once they left the church. With echoes of the raid on the Branch Davidian compound in Waco, Texas, that led to the siege on the Branch Davidian compound and the death of many of the members of the denomination led by David Koresh, the ATF raided the apartment of a Calvary member in 2017, where the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives found dozens of guns that were apparently set aside for the church. Not unlike the Branch Davidians, the church also had a compound in West Virginia that Scott said would be used in the event that the persecution from the authorities became so great that they needed to flee. Perhaps the most damning story when it comes to Scott was an allegation made by his son and his son's wife in an email that was then sent to congregants. The email alleged that the pastor had molested two young nieces for years, starting in California and continuing in Virginia until the 1970s. The email read, in part, quote, "They were just innocent children, and you abused your power and your authority." The police in Virginia declined to charge the pastor, but they referred the case to California authorities. In 2021, Kevin O'Connor, the church deacon who had been accused of abuse by the two girls earlier, was eventually charged by the Loudoun County Sheriff's Office. Former members like Greg have built a community together, bonding over their religious trauma and their desire to help people leave Calvary. Today, we're going to talk about community and loss, power and religion, the prevalence of cults hidden behind buildings that look like any other religious organization, religious trauma in general, and what happens to you emotionally and socially when religious leaders, the people who are supposed to guide us, our shepherds, betray us. Greg, I just wanted to thank you for coming on to have this conversation with me. Increasingly, like for me, one of the topics that I hear people talking more and more about is this idea of their relationship with God versus their relationship with religion. And it's very interesting. I had someone write me recently to say that like religious trauma is sort of the one form of trauma that we don't really feel as comfortable talking about. So I just really appreciate you being willing, I guess, to be so open about this. And, like ever since we met, because, we met originally because you were coming in to do some sort of like career development work and sort of life transition related working as a part of coaching. I've always felt like a really deep bond and affinity for you as a person. And, I was kind of reluctant to even ask you to come on to talk about these things because I didn't want to pull you back into this place. But I think this can be really beneficial for people, regardless of whether they were a part of something as extreme as Calvary or they, were in a less benign religious institution or organization and had some kind of trauma. So thanks, Greg.
Hey, it's a pleasure. I'm really glad you thought of me, and I got to say, I feel the same. As a matter of fact, one thing I can recall about how we met, there was career transition at that time in my life, but there was a lot. It was even a lot more. I was dealing with some pretty traumatic things, and in particular, I was in therapy partially because I guess I just kind of collapsed like a heap one day, and I hadn't realized quite how much my life at Calvary Temple had affected me and how much trauma I had to recover from.
Right.
So, yeah, I am happy to shed light on that and to help people who may be under the same kind of pressures or the same sort of religious trauma. It's a real thing, and people need to know that they're heard and that they're loved, that there's a way out and a way forward.
Do you have any idea from your perspective about why people find it difficult to talk about? And I'm thinking about like not even necessarily the idea of sort of stepping out and kind of ending up in conflict with the organization, but just sort of talking to the average regular person about the topic.
Um, I can think of a few things. For one, let's talk. Let's think about a place like Calvary, and there are places like Calvary. Maybe the most famous example in our country was the People's Church that Jim Jones founded, where people learned about Jonestown, Guyana, and that mass suicide.
That's the mass suicide with Kool-Aid, right?
The one with Kool-Aid. Well, yeah, and so yeah, what a disturbing. It's still short before 9/11. That was the worst incident with the highest amount of casualties to ever occur.
Do you remember? Because as I recall, Jones was in California, and the authorities had started to put pressure on him, so he took everyone down.
I think you're right. So that kind of extreme, what starts to happen is in extreme religious faith or cults, they make exit very difficult. I was listening to a testimony from someone who used to be in Calvary, and while there's never a stated prohibition such as if you leave Calvary, you're going to fall back into sin and perdition. You're going to lose your salvation, or you'll never find a place like Calvary. No one would ever say those words out loud, but to forbid you from leaving, they would kind of shame you or make you second guess, or so-called gaslighting. There was, well, all right, have you considered that if you leave Calvary, this will happen? Or why should you leave anyway? Because why would you want to leave? The word of God is here. We know you and we love you. And why would you go anyplace else? And so they make exit very difficult, either through just basically sheerly forbidding you from leaving, or from making exit seem like a really bad idea.
Yeah, and I think probably for a lot of the folks who don't know about some of the bad behaviors, that can be a great motivator. And some of the people who have a clue of what the church's relationship with ex-members are like, that could probably be a great motivator too. Like you don't necessarily know the pain of the ex-members, but when you hear a story about something like a church member who no longer communicates with their family because their family left.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Calvary is notorious for basically forbidding parents from talking to their children if their children have left the faith or have, disobeyed their teaching. And if you, in fact, have been inculcated in a place like Calvary and your indoctrination is pretty severe, you have now left behind your old way of life and your friends and your families, so that you're no longer connected to any other community but Calvary. So your friends all go to Calvary, and your family are all part of Calvary. Or if you've lost your mother and father, now behold your mother and father, as Jesus might have said. Because if you're not willing to leave fathers, mothers, you're not worthy of being my disciple. So Calvary takes that to an extreme and says, these are your fathers and mothers, and these are your parents. And then when you want to go do other activities, it's probably with someone from Calvary. Or if you want to go to the gym, well, Calvary has a gym.
Yeah. So it's not that you're just leaving a church, like switching a church and going. You're leaving everything.
Yeah.
When you leave.
And so that does put fear into you. And at some point in time, you're going to have to wrestle with that and think, now what am I going to do? I'll never forget when the day came and I left Calvary. All of my friends, they were in Calvary, so I didn't have anybody to talk to. So that wasn't a light thing to me,
Yeah, because it's like you mentioned that word, it's like your community, and in our community is our sort of sense of belonging in the world and our North Star and our compass, and you're giving up a lot more than a place that you go to on Sunday or Wednesday or what other day.
Starting from the ground up is not comfortable.
Yeah.
You're at sea. I mean, there's no place to go.
Right. One of the things that really struck me about hearing about Calvary, because I don't know if I told you this, but at the time when you told me about your experience with Calvary, I was living in Leesburg, which is the town over from Sterling. And as much as I read the newspaper and I educate myself and I saw clients from all over the region, I had never heard of Calvary Temple. I'd probably driven by it, God knows how many times. But one of the things that sort of struck me about the story was this idea that, like, just down the street from me, behind, in these sort of like leafy streets in this sort of, what we would think is this almost perfect American suburb, filled with things like community centers, neighborhood pools, like middle class living. There's essentially this organization that's operating like a cult. Mm-hmm. In a place like that. That's right. We think of places like Waco, Texas, or rural places, or even maybe in some cities, but we don't think of like a cult sitting in the middle of what people feel is a kind of progressive suburban community. And I was curious, is that like, for you, is that kind of like, was it kind of a blinding thing? Like what was it that originally caused you to like join the church, and did it feel safe, I guess, is what I'm getting.
Yeah. Okay. So I was in high school. I was always that sort of outcast kid, I was in the theater and didn't have a whole lot going for me, and friends and things like that. So I don't think I ever felt like I had my niche group. I can remember being in my psychology class and hearing the teacher warn us that, if you are a loner, cults like to pick you out of the crowd and try to recruit you. To which I would say, that's absurd. That'll never happen to me. I'm completely independent.
I'm too smart.
I'm way too smart. So I was at one of my, dead end jobs, and somebody working there with me noticed I was on my off time. I was reading also Sprach Zarathustra by Nietzsche, and he said, "Oh, what's that book about?" I said, well, it's basically that's where you ever heard God is dead? That's where it comes from. God is dead. And he says, if I gave you a book to read, would you accept that? Well, okay. What's the book? So this is Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. Which
classic.
I want to say in its defense, that is a wonderful book. It truly is. Yeah. But when someone's trying to use it to recruit you to a cult, then the Bible's a wonderful book too. So he was witnessing to me a lot, telling me he believed in Jesus, and telling me, that if those who believed are saved and those who believe not shall be damned, and that's not good news. I need to. Now at that time, I 19 years old thereabouts, and I lived in Alexandria with my girlfriend. Didn't go to school, didn't go to college. Not a good idea. Made my dad very unhappy. But when someone's telling me, hey, you could join this and you can have salvation and freedom and a community of people that love you, in spite of how fearful it was to finally attend Calvary Temple service with him and hear people for the first time in my life speaking in tongues and outwardly praising God and singing songs that they weren't found in a hymnal. It was unsettling. But at the same time, I thought, hey, these people look pretty happy. They look like they have it together. I know this is weird, but I feel kind of good, and I'm gonna take the plunge. And so there I am. And I didn't even have own socks. I had like these loafers that, look how I was trying to dress up, I guess, like Don Johnson from Miami Vice. It was the late 80s when, I had a mullet and everything, really long hair. And so that, just to give you an example of how it felt when I did that altar call and asked Jesus into my heart, and everybody just started, welcome to the family. God bless you. You're going to love it. You're going to be so happy. We're so glad you came. The following week, I believe it was, somebody said, the Lord put it on my heart and gave me a box of shoes. Okay. Because he saw that I had these like dilapidated loafers. And so he gave me shoes. So at some point in time, I remember I didn't know how to drive. Somebody from the church taught me how to drive.
Oh, wow.
I didn't have a place to live because, I can't live in sin with my girlfriend. Somebody, I got a roommate. And so my life in the church began and in earnest. And I just, that's pretty much how I got recruited.
Yeah. What did that feel like? Like that moment where you did the altar call and that moment, those moments where everyone was embracing you, did it feel like something you hadn't experienced, like in terms of connection to people or love?
Yes, it certainly did. Some people have quite profound experiences when they describe being born again, and I did. I remember feeling like some kind of heavy weight was being pulled out of my body from my shoulders, and like I felt great. And I remember thinking, I can hear the birds better. The sky looks different, and I am not the same person anymore. Something happened to me, and to be fair, that is exactly what happened to me.
Right.
I can only tell you that it felt blissful and supernatural. The life that I had in Calvary was nothing like that. It was painful and arduous, and it was usually sad. But that particular experience, it was otherworldly, and it was uplifting.
I was going to ask, I'm just curious about, what was your religious experience like before joining Calvary?
The first time I ever saw a portrait of Jesus, I was about 3 years old. It was at Liberty Grove United Methodist Church in Burtonsville, Maryland. And I thought that was my Uncle Billy. You see, my Uncle Billy.
This is in the late 1970s when a lot of people looked like
late
Jesus.
60s, late 60s, early 70s, thereabouts. So my Uncle Billy was kind of a hippie, and still is, come to think of it. And I don't think he'd mind being called that. But I thought that portrait of Jesus, that was my Uncle Billy. So I went to Sunday school at Liberty Grove, but after 9 or 10, I grew bored with it and had no religious faith. My father and I moved to Fairfax around 1978. It sounds, 78.
So you went from the Maryland suburbs to the Virginia suburbs.
Yeah. I mean, despite being born in San Diego when my dad was in the Navy, I'm really a DC, Maryland, Virginia kind of guy. I've always been in Northern Virginia, hail to the Redskins and all that.
You can run, but you can't hide.
Yeah, exactly.
It's so rare, by the way. That's an interesting thing that I didn't even think about. You, as somebody who grew up in the Washington suburbs, a lot of people who don't know the DC suburbs don't know how transient it is. Yeah. It's not like a normal, like it's very rare for me to run into somebody who grew up in DC.
Yeah, same here. Well, and as like someone born and raised in DC, I can probably think of people, like maybe count on one hand, people I've met, because you tend to be someone who works there, or you tend to be someone who moved there. but I don't know very many people who were born and raised in the district, let alone, the Northern Virginia or Maryland,
Yeah.
because they tend to come from somewhere else.
Yeah, and it's a different experience. Like I grew up when I was in Georgia. I grew up with the kids that I came to the Northern Virginia area when I was in high school, but all the kids I went to elementary school, for the most part, we were all there every year. We all went to middle school together. Even though I left, we stayed in touch when we all went off to high school, but we grew up with the same group of people. We had a sense of community, if that makes sense. And I
Right.
think in the DC area, because it's so transient, like growing up, like every year, some group of your friends are rotating out. Maybe you don't get that same sense of belonging that other people.
Right. You tend to, people you grew up with in high school tend to leave, they tend to find some other way of life and they tend to leave. Like, they became, I don't know, they wanted to go into entertainment. Well, there's nothing here. So they left and went to whatever, Nashville, New York, Los Angeles, whatever. So they tend to leave. And yeah, I can't think of too many people I've known all my adult life or something like that.
Yeah, who you sort of like, yeah, grew up with and had that. So it must have been kind of powerful because a place like Calvary probably offered that, if it
Yes.
makes sense.
Oh, yeah. And you think, like, I was a musician, and I remember one of my best friends was also a guitar player. And so we spent a lot of time camaraderie playing music together, and that kind of stuff. You couldn't find it without a place like Calvary, because Calvary kind of creates that sort of fishbowl experience where your whole world is in that fishbowl. And,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, there's nothing like it. And it's quite unsettling and painful when it's all gone.
Yeah, I remember, I think it was a little bit after we had met. I remember reading this local newspaper article. It was 2016 when the first women really sort of like got headlines
Yeah.
for allegations of like physical, emotional, and then later we found out sexual abuse. And then out of the woodworks, like protesters started showing up in front of the church, like,
Right.
when they were doing their Easter egg hunts or camps, or they did this thing that I have yet to see at any other church, but they used to have the car shows. And
Oh my
um,
God. They sure
yeah,
did.
and they're
Yeah.
all up and down. Yeah. And I imagine all of those things were like great recruitment tools. But when the protesters showed up, like, I think it came a little bit more into the public consciousness in this area that
Yeah.
there were challenges. But my understanding is it was going on long before 2016. Like, what was your experience in the church like?
So let me see if I can recall. So I left on very, 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 very bad terms in 1998, and I'll tell the story. I'm not afraid. I was I was working in DC, and there was a girl working there, and she was married, but we were attracted to each other. So I had a very, very brief, not very pleasant experience. I had an affair with a married woman, and the church found out, and they put me out to pastor.
Do you
And
know how they found out?
I told them. I
Okay.
said, listen, I'm having a really hard time, and I know I'm in sin, and I really want help. And
Mm.
yeah, yeah, boy, oh boy, that was the last thing I should have done. But I mean, it's
Oh, but
not
it
like they
seems like
never.
the obvious thing, right? Like you're going through this thing that's painful. You're
Yeah,
going through this difficult thing. You're very conflicted about it.
yeah,
And the message is sort of like confess your sins, get help. Like,
sure. And maybe, hey, maybe they didn't think I was sincere. Maybe they didn't think I really wanted to change. I don't know. Or maybe it just had been something that they were expecting of me, and say, okay, I knew this was going to happen. Get out of here. Well, then I basically went and I became kind of a pilgrim, and I went through a lot of different experiences. I did fall in love and meet the woman I'm still married to. So that's great. And we tried going to places like neo-pagan festivals and really didn't feel at home there.
You let the pendulum swing in the opposite direction.
Oh, yeah. Oh, man. Because you think, well, that didn't work. Let's try something else. And I didn't read a Bible for almost 10 years after I left Calvary because I couldn't bear it. I was afraid.
Wow. Afraid of what?
Well, my first experience when I was all alone and I didn't have any place to go, I remember having dreams every night about people from Calvary.
Oh, wow.
Or experiences I had there. And that went on for months. And the Bible, because I had known such a repressive existence and it tended to be in the context of a scripture, I thought, well, then I don't want to read it anymore because all it does is bring me pain. So I don't want to read it anymore.
So it's almost like a trigger. Right?
Yeah. So somehow throughout that experience, I think at 2015, 2016, I was still I still had a Facebook account, and somehow somebody reached out to me. I think it might have been a former member. I'm pretty sure it was someone mentioned in the article named Michelle Freeman, and discussed with me, okay, there's a lot going on at Calvary that you may not be aware of. And then somehow I found out about the article about the allegations against one of their deacons and his adopted niece or adopted daughter. Forgive me, I can't remember exactly.
That's Kevin O'Connor, who was
That's
charged.
Kevin O'Connor, who I was acquainted with, and his daughter, who I also knew as a child. And when I learned that those allegations had been discarded by the Loudoun County Deputy Sheriff. By the way, one of the Loudoun County Deputy Sheriffs was a member of Calvary.
Right.
In fact,
prominent member, right?
Prominent member. So then I remember having this experience of my heart felt like it was breaking. And I never felt I never realized how bad it really was there. I knew that I didn't like it, and I knew that they were hard on people, and I knew it was repressive, and I knew that there was some fiduciary wrongdoing from Star Scott. I learned that from other ministers is, he's up to no good, and I'll tell you why. And that I knew. But what I didn't know is that it went even further, and that children, young women were undergoing painful experiences like sexual abuse. I didn't know. But when I heard about it, my heart just sank. And I remember then I started reading the scriptures again and talking about shepherds that were herding the sheep. And somebody in that community from the Facebook group, I think, about Exposed Calvary Temple said, yep, I read that very same one. And it just dawned on me, okay, this is something I should check out, and this is something I should take part in. So I went to one of those early protests in front of the congregation, and I was seeing people that I hadn't seen for over 10 years. And one of them who, in fact, a couple of them were children when I knew them. And they were, one of them has a YouTube channel. His father was one of the piano players for that church. And he was also an ex-member of Calvary because of things that he experienced there. And I remember seeing them when they were children. And one of them told me, oh, I remember you. I said, you do? And I didn't know who it was, but said, didn't you used to babysit me or something? Or didn't I used to come to your house when my uncle was babysitting? I said, oh my goodness, you're that little boy? And now they're this tall adult person. But there were kids that had been through that ministry who were able to expose not just the secrets about Kevin O'Connor's proclivities, but also of Pastor Scott's past sins that had never been brought to
discussed. So that was really those young people who were growing up, who were exposed to things, who overheard their, because we all think that the children really aren't listening, but they are.
Oh yeah.
So as a child in an environment, you're probably exposed to a lot of things where adults forget that you can process it, or
Mm.
someday you put it together. And I was going to ask you, it's sort of about that, to that point of like Pastor Scott's, Star Scott's wrongdoing. Like, those women had come forward with their own allegations. They weren't directly against him, but I remember reading the story that really, really struck me. It was 2002. Apparently, these events happened, but Scott's wife Janet, she's dying. They're in their 50s at that particular point, but it really struck me that he had supposedly claimed from the pulpit that the book of Leviticus forbade him from mourning the death of, because he was a high priest and the high priests were forbidden from mourning,
Right.
and that instead they were supposed to take a wife in her virginity. Now, I don't know if that's biblical. I don't remember that in the Bible.
Well, yeah. Now, that was my understanding. So I had been long since shunned, but when I heard about that, and I knew who the young lady was
Because I'm just wondering if
child.
it came from the top, it sounds like.
Right. So what? Yeah, exactly. Basically, if there was a direction that he wanted to take the congregation, he would find an obscure passage, usually in the Old Testament, and say, okay, this principle means that I'm allowed to make this decision for everybody. So let's say, so that business, that was why a lot of people left, apparently, because what he didn't even mourn the passing of his late wife Janet, but took a young lady from the congregation who apparently accepted kicking and screaming, but eventually relented, and they were married, and I believe they still are. So somebody 20, 30 years his junior,
Right.
basically
Just out of high school.
just out of high school, and he in his 50s. And that was enough to drive a lot of people out and say, okay, that's not going to work for me. So thankfully, some people had some shred of conscience left.
Yeah, and my understanding is they got married like a week after he gave that sermon. You just mentioned kicking and screaming. What did you mean by that?
I'm told by someone in the know who had been an ex-member of Calvary and part of the protest that she cried when she found out that that's what Bob or Pastor Scott wanted to do. That she, I don't want this. I don't want. But somebody, one of her peers, just said, "But just think about it. This is the Lord's gift, and it's a blessing. And you've been anointed by God. You have a special call on your life. Don't you want that?" And somebody basically, using subterfuge and witchcraft to convince her to do something that she was violently opposed to.
So basically he made the decision,
Yeah.
went to her parents or whoever and decided, wow.
Say, today's your lucky day. And he also, the child's father, he basically promoted him to a member of the leadership. And did I also tell you? Yeah, you've been promoted, buddy. You're a pastor or evangelist or a teacher. Congratulations. God's good, isn't he? Some kind of bribery, I guess. It's just revolting when you think about it.
So you were saying the beginning of the end, probably, of that.
I think so. But I can recall when I was a member, let's suppose they wanted to retire their church's mortgage. Okay, that's a good idea. So what he did is he found some obscure passage in the Old Testament about a third tithe. There's a tithe that you give, that's the first thing that you give in an offering. There's another one that you use for another purpose, like refreshing yourself and having, a ministry for yourself, to make yourself, like by praise and worship music or something like that. And the third one is, so you can give it to the congregation and we'll start a fund and we'll retire our mortgage, which I believe they did. They had a mortgage burning ceremony, but they also bought that fleet of Corvettes that he owns for the race car ministry. Whoa. And someone who, after leaving, and one of the places I attended was a Presbyterian church, which is why I think I'm Presbyterian now, because I feel like they were some of the first people to ever kind of put me back together again after I'd fallen off my ledge, And I'm still very grateful to be a part of them. But they had been aware that there was this 67 fastback that was in his fleet of Corvettes, pretty exceedingly rare and very, very cool car. So this Corvette
I assume
was
very expensive.
very expensive, and it was apparently bequeathed to Star Scott on somebody's deathbed. He said, I want you to have this car. Now,
No way.
I just can't understand that. I don't, I'd have to suss that out and, basically vet that story, but it goes to show you the kind of heart that he has, and the fact that he owns that egregious largesse for himself anyway.
Right.
And of course,
are you getting the idea that it felt like he was very in it for himself?
Yeah. And in, I think it was Michelle Borstein's article in the Washington Post. Headline goes something like, "In Virginia, a powerful and polarizing pastor." And that story about his particular largesse and fiduciary wrongdoing, living off of a church credit card and things like those weren't facts that I knew, but I wasn't surprised when I apprehended and learned about them. There's another article in the Times Mirror and the Post where they covered.
That's the Loudoun Times Mirror.
Yeah, the Loudoun Times Mirror and the Washington Post both covered an ATF raid where they basically acquired a number of large weapons and arms, small arms.
Oh,
from an apartment.
There was an ATF raid. I mean, this is having echoes of Waco and David Koresh right now.
Right. So now, when I learned about that, the ATF found all those guns. I knew people from Calvary loved guns. In fact, I remember going on a camping trip in Blue Murray, West Virginia, and we were shooting, whatever the Greek copy of an AK-47 is, the Kalashnikov, a couple of 22s, and we were firing arms in the middle of some field somewhere, shooting because everybody had guns. And there were serious talks. In fact, he shared with the congregation, I hope this never happens, but if it does, and we're forced to go underground because the persecution of the world becomes too much, we have a property in some undisclosed location. I think it might have been in West Virginia as well, but to be truthful, I don't remember. But they definitely alluded to having a sort of compound in the ready when at such point they decided the world persecution was too much and they had to flee. Not at all dissimilar to how Jim Jones left Northern California and went to Guyana.
Yeah.
Okay. So they were definitely cooking up a Guyana situation, a Jonestown situation. And so when the ATF found all that weaponry in an apartment belonging to a Calvary Temple member, I can't say I was surprised. In fact, I bet there's more.
Right. Well,
aren't you glad I left?
Right. Yes. One of the things I remember, I'm curious about one thing. What did it feel like in that moment where you were a part of sort of like the protests? Did you have any conflicting feelings at that point, or was it freeing? Like, what did it feel like when you got involved with the people who had gone through bad experiences there?
It was bittersweet. I remember seeing people I hadn't seen for a very long time and thinking, wow, I'm glad you're okay. There was a particular guy there that I remember we were really close at during our Calvary days, and we had some really good times together. And I remember having a laugh, saying, hey, it's good to see you again. And I wish it could be different. But I also remember looking across the street at the congregation and some of the people getting into their cars, and I'm saying, oh, isn't that so-and-so? I used to be his roommate. Isn't that that girl? I used to be a friend of hers. And looking at them, and they probably wouldn't say that they felt anything, but I looked at them and they looked like they were wearing chains around their ankles, and they looked crestfallen, and they looked taciturn, and they looked sad. And pitiful. And that was heartbreaking to look and think, I used to be that guy. And that's how I used to feel every day. Although I would have told you, hey, praise God, I'm doing good. God's good. I'm having a great day. The Lord's blessing me. But deep inside, I'm like, get me the hell out of here,
At what point, like thinking about that moment at the altar and feeling so good and feeling so accepted and belonging, at what moment did it flip to that kind of sadness?
Well, I can think of like early days when I was there feeling uncertain and shaky. And I thought, well, that's just part of the experience. Of course, I feel that way.
Right.
But over the years, when I would deal with various temptations and trials, I remember feeling like, I'll tell you one thing that happened to me. Since I played the guitar and I wanted to use that gift in ministry or somehow, and the church was definitely not having it. And they read it and said, we don't think you're ready for this, and we want you to keep that at the altar, and we want you to, wait and just, be in the
Was it
Word
the
and be a
idea of
disciple,
they just didn't want you to pick up the guitar or play it in the church or outside the church? What was
Yeah, a little of both, really.
okay.
And then at one point when it was pretty clear that, okay, I think we're ready now, let's go ahead and let's start seeing what you can do. And I would take part in the worship team for a while, but I would do something that,
Do you think that was about control?
yeah, it was,
Yeah.
that's an experience that a lot of people can talk about having. And you were still under that microscope, even when you were in the ministry. And so every once in a while they're uplifting you and praising. Great, man, the Lord really used you today. That's great. And then one day you did or said something that was just off in their mind. And so then they say, Greg, I think we're going to have you remain silent for a while and not, give voice in the congregation or speak up in the congregation. And what did I do?
Oh, you
One
mean
more.
talk at all?
Yeah,
Like so it was
right.
like hush, be quiet.
Yeah, you would go through experiences like that, or where you're basically under their microscope, being watched, unsure about whether or not you are doing the right thing or the wrong
Kind
thing.
of like a yo-yo of
Yeah.
affirmation, right?
And the
Like
longer that went on, the worse I remember feeling. I am never going to amount to anything here. I'm never going to get married. I'm never going to have kids. I'm never going to have this life that so many people seem to be having a great time with, but I'm never going to be that guy because I'm one of the people that they don't like, or I'm one of the people they don't trust, or something. And the longer that went
were
on,
they involved in those things? Like involved in who you could marry and other
yeah,
things like that?
yeah, I
Mm.
would say so. I remember if you fancied somebody and they didn't want that person to marry you, they'd find a way to discourage you really quick. And yeah, apparently they had their favorites and they had their outcasts too.
Mm. So there it was almost like it was a subtle kind of transformation for you. I'm curious when you left, when there was that affair and they sort of admonished you for that, do you think that they were trying to lay out some, because when people, it sounds like based on what you're saying that they almost use people's mistakes or when they were off key, to take the musical metaphor, when they were off key, they use their mistakes to further control people. Do you think that's what they were aiming for in admonishing you? That like,
Probably.
yeah,
And to be fair, I think in their mind they had probably thought, we have been with this over and over. Greg is always having some problem. He's always having some difficulty, and we can never get him to walk in lockstep with us. And now this, yeah, well, we've had it.
mm.
And I can see how they might have seen it that way, frankly, because to them they were building this utopia experience where
Mm.
they were the world's they were the city set on the hill, and
Did
the
they
world.
try to rehabilitate you from your perspective? Like, did they give you a
Um,
path? Like, do X and we'll let you stay, or did they ask
no,
you to
no,
leave?
and that's surprising because it's not like I was the first person to. I mean, there were members of that leadership who say they had an affair with a member of the congregation, and so they put them in. Basically, they took them out of their ministry role and made them clean the church for a while. And then after many endeavors, they were restored, as long as there wasn't another repeat of the same thing, I guess, is basically what they were looking for.
So there was something about you, like there was some kind of double standard. So like in a
So
way,
it seemed, yeah.
you left because you were getting pushed. What did that feel like to be pushed out of this place that for a decade had been your...
Yeah, I remember after I'd been there for so long, the strange thing is that when I was no longer welcome back and I was all alone, I remember thinking, wow, I've been through a lot, haven't I? This wasn't right, was it? I've been kind of emotionally abused, haven't I?
It was like the veil
I
lifted.
didn't know it was that bad, huh? So, yeah, I guess to be honest, it felt like, the scales fell off my eyes, whatever
It'd
metaphor
be
you want to use.
freeing. Yeah.
Yeah, it
Like
really did.
freeing in a way. Wow. And now, the 2016 protest started. And then a couple of years later, there was this other significant event, as I recall, that Pastor Scott's son, who was also, I think, named Star Scott
Yes.
Jr., his wife sends an email, from the way that I understand it, and I may not be remembering this right, but accusing Scott, the pastor, of molesting his two young nieces for years when he was the youth pastor at another Pentecostal church. I think it was in California, and that he continued to molest them when he got to Virginia. And there was this quote in there. There was this quote in there that screams something like, they were innocent children, or they were just innocent children, and you abused your power and authority.
Yeah.
What was it like to hear that?
That I don't know. I remember just thinking, man, he was more like Jim Jones than I even knew, and thinking, what an awful perversion and what a disgraceful thing. And not only that, but learning about just the copious lengths he went to hide that story from ever coming to light, and ordering his congregation. I think Star Robert Scott II.
That's his
son. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think Star had some document, such as an email, that would have basically had the details of that story as told from the Assembly of God church that Bob originated from in Monterey, California, I think. And he had the details of that story, and that he was forbidding the congregation from ever reading that, and that young Star was so zealous to protect his father that anybody who was trying to bring it to light, he would violently threaten them and tell them, I could ruin you. I know exactly how to hurt you, and I won't hesitate to, come after you if you come after my father. So to think, I'd never seen that side of them, but I should have known.
That sort of like the,
I thought, how did I not see that? Right?
Protecting their power for many of them was more important than...
Yeah, and I didn't know the violent lengths that they would go to in order to prevent that allegation from coming out or to protect their own. I remember being at one of the protests, and one of those members of the Calvary congregation drove their car dangerously close and skidded in a gravel pathway next to the road to basically try to frighten off some of the protesters. And I'm thinking, when I think of the story of Heather Heyer in
Charlottesville,
he was murdered by that man in the car and who plowed into the protesters against that Confederate monument. I thought of that, and I thought that almost happened to us. And I heard people from Calvary. You have to understand, people from Calvary, and I was one of them, we never cussed. We stopped talking that way. And here they were dropping F-bombs and threatening and shouting all these invectives at us. What has happened to them?
And trying to at least scare you or possibly kill you.
So to see Starr go after somebody in a Facebook group threatening them with basically blackmail and violence, I didn't know that was in them. And I thought I should have known, because what's in your heart, the mouth just speaks what's in your heart. I should have known that they were that violent and that malevolent.
Did you feel like you were talking to me about like knowing, the 20-year-old that Scott married, and knowing some of these younger children and Kevin O'Connor and his adopted daughter who alleged that he had done sexual and physical abuse. And, before we started recording, you mentioned you even worked in the child care center with people. Did you feel like a sense of guilt when you found out about those allegations?
Well, remorse would be closer to it. I wondered, first of all, if I'd done anything to contribute to their fear and upbringing, because as a child care worker, we probably administered spankings because they believed in corporal punishment and they believed in spanking children. And I'm pretty sure I gave out a spanking or two. And that certainly made me feel remorse and guilt. Like I wish I'd never laid hand on a child, because I think that's barbarous. I've never laid a hand on my son. He's going on 16, and we've never spanked him. We don't believe in it. I think it's a barbarous way to discipline a child. So I felt a little bit of remorse, because I thought, couldn't I have paid more attention and seen that something was off? Couldn't I have, done something to make a difference?
Did he? I remember hearing a story that later even a former church member tried to, or they were a member at the time, tried to secretly record a conversation with him about it. So there are clearly people, as the allegations started to come out, who were sort of bonding together to try and address these members. But how is it that at that time you guys were raising your voices, raising your concerns, even protesting outside of the church? And, I assume some people had contact information of current church members. How is it that so few of the church members, was it that they just didn't accept the allegations, or did they just not find out about them?
To an extent, I think that for those who remained members, they were accustomed to shunning those who left and saying, they went out from us and they're not one of us. So they were accustomed to regarding them as enemies and under the influence of Satan or something demonic. They were accustomed to believing that they were under severe persecution from the community around them, from the world at large, so that if they heard such, they might have a bit of cognitive dissonance, but in most likely scenario, they would probably think, oh, that's a lie. That's Satan trying to tell a lie and sow doubt into our, that's obviously not true. And so I think that for those that remained there, the fear of betraying the leadership is probably greater than any whisper of cognitive dissonance that they might feel. So even if they had their doubts, they would never give them voice.
I remember there was some point, it was before the 2016, 2014 stuff. The Washington Post did a article on Calvary. It's like, as a former journalist, I call it the "we can't nail it, but there's something really wrong here" story. But did you participate in any of the, like with any of the, if you're comfortable talking about it, with any of the journalists or others who were trying to escape the truth?
So from the Loudoun Times-Mirror, I did get interviewed by a former journalist there named Crystal Owens, and she wrote some of my remarks in one of those articles, and I'm trying to remember. It's the one, oh yeah, a year later, or the Calvary Temple's Emotional Warfare, I believe is the title. And I got to share some of the ways that it felt to be a member and have your doubts, but not be able to speak about them. And they cited some psychological expertise in that particular article. Michelle Borstein, I believe, did some of the writing for the Washington Post. In fact, I think she's still their religion writer. And so she was doing research about the Calvary article, and she contacted me as well.
Mm.
I
Why did you decide to speak out?
Well, at first, in Michelle's case, I was pretty hesitant and I was a little frightened. I was fearing reprisals. I didn't know the lengths that members of the Calvary congregation would go to protect themselves. And for all I knew, they would come after me or my family. I don't know if anything like that has ever taken place, but I do know that when I knew that they were violent people with violent histories
and lots of guns,
and they had a lot of baggage, I didn't want to I didn't want to risk that shaking up a hornet's nest. But then when I guess after Crystal had reached out and some of the protests were beginning, at that point I thought, hey, I've got to stop being afraid because people deserve to know. There are people that are frightened of leaving, and this might embolden them to finally make peace and find a new life. And so I thought that's what got me speaking. And to say that when I heard the young girl's allegations against Kevin O'Connor, when I thought of her and I knew her as a child, I thought I cannot let her suffer alone, and I can't. And she may never know me, and she may never see me again. But the thought that she couldn't defend herself and somebody had done those things to her, I can't just let how I feel influence me, and I can't let my fear and inhibition keep me from shouting this up from the rooftops. People deserve to know.
Yeah. And the church was, I know, the allegations about him, the beginning of his sexual abuse with his nieces starts in the, late 70s or so. But one of the things, I had read was that in the 80s and the 90s, Calvary, interestingly, with a business name, it was under the business name. It was doing business as Calvary, but it was like known as something like Star Evangelical or Evangelical Enterprises. But they had opened churches in Africa and several U.S. cities like Richmond and Laurel.
Yep. I used to go to that Richmond congregation to play guitar in their worship services. So I would drive 2 hours from the, Northern Virginia to go join their worship team because they didn't have one. Yeah.
Wow. And I know they drew at some point like people from all over the East Coast, like wealthy people in Middleburg, Virginia, people, who to people who could sort of like barely afford food and diapers for their kids in West Virginia. Yeah. And like I'm just curious, like what was the appeal? Like my understanding is they had like 40 branch churches in East Africa, and it just seems hard for me to understand how, with those things going on, forget the sexual abuse, forget the financial improprieties, but just the control. Now, one part of me says, like, how could people live in an environment that's so oppressive and controlling? And then another part of me says that the world is so complex, things are so ambiguous, it's so easy to feel lost. And even though we know someone else controlling us is not healthy, like control gives us this sense of guardrails. So it's almost like the abuse itself, we want something, and that abuse provides it, not a healthy version of it. But talk to me about that.
If you're convinced of your own sinfulness and your low self-esteem has been lower still, and you've basically come to no longer trust yourself, they can take a scripture like from Proverbs 3 thereabouts, that he who trusts himself is a fool. So if you have been taught, I don't make good decisions, I don't even know how to make good decisions, I need the Holy Spirit. And so I need the leadership, and I need Calvary. I need their wisdom, because they obviously know how to live. Look at them. Look how Lord, look at all those
Corvette.
cars, look at the houses, look at the way of life that they lead. Don't you want that? And so I mean, it's hard sometimes, I admit it, but they know what they're doing, and I don't trust myself as far as I can throw myself. So I don't know how to live and act, but they do. And if you start to believe, well, this is the only congregation that's teaching the truth, so of course we have to branch out. Of course we need to go to all the world and preach the gospel. So yeah, we need to open up fellowships in Africa and reach out to the poor savages in West Virginia. Of course we do, because the gospel's not being taught by anybody but us. We've got to help them.
Yeah, it reminds me of in psychology, one of the things that we learn is that there's a certain type of people who narcissists gravitate toward, right? Like people who are downtrodden, people who
That's right.
are isolated, who feel alone, or even people who just are dependent and they need a lot of, feedback to feel loved. But there's also this other side of it that we talk about less, where certain kinds of people, who might need structure or order, or for the world to make sense, or they need that love, gravitate toward narcissists because their overconfidence, their arrogance is interpreted as strength, and it gives people a sense of safety.
And I mean, it explains a lot. The cult-like behavior of our former president and his devoted following.
Yes.
They follow many of those same. In fact, many of the people of my former congregation are probably in his thrall, because what ultimately attracts someone like that is power, or the belief that this is some kind of high achiever. And they do give the appearance of being a high achiever, narcissist, that is. And when Star Scott lived off of the wealth of his company or congregation, and gave the appearance of being rich and wearing, the jewelry and getting the expensive vacations and the cars, always having some kind of really expensive car to drive around, then people look at that and, well, that's success. Those are the trappings of success. And to say nothing of the fact that he's, teaching every Sunday, and he's got that powerful, charismatic draw, seeing the outward things gives you and so, everybody thinks that's the alpha male, or that's the lead dog, and I should be following them. And that, I guess, what attracts someone is having no sense of their own worth and their own moral compass, their own locus of control, basically.
And
of course, that's who the Lord wants me to follow, because I don't control myself. My locus of control is from the Lord, and the Holy Spirit is guiding me. That's who he's guiding me to, because look at the fruit, right? I can see from the outside, I can see that guy is clearly walking with the Lord, right?
And it feels like a gift, right? Like this sense that you're being granted this kind of...
Right. And when you live your whole life thinking that your locus of control comes from some supernatural place, you have that sense of calling or belonging kind of dealt into you, and it sort of confirms what you think is happening. And you believe, oh yeah, I knew I needed to find some place where they taught the word of God. Oh, there's one. And so of course you think, this is it. This must be it. And because your feelings and thoughts validate it, and they're only too happy to help validate that feeling for you,
I'm just curious for you, have you been able to find, since leaving, you mentioned the thing about not being able to read the Bible for so many years after.
Right.
Have you been able to find any kind of religious
I have,
community?
and I'll tell you, I think I think I told you this earlier when my wife and I first met. We actually participated in
And that was, you
neo-pagan.
met her after the church, right?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
met her after I went to church, after I'd left. And we went to neo-pagan stuff for a while because they're nice people and they have kind of a supernatural
And also,
belief.
yeah,
But
they've got the charismatic piece, but almost like totally the opposite.
right, it's a little bit new agey and stuff. And then I remember leaving that and going to an extreme where I started following the new atheists like Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris, and
Mhm.
reading those and say, okay, well that's it. I was wrong about God all along. I don't believe a bit of it. I should have been rationalist. And I remember shaking hands with Dr. Michael Shermer or James Randi, and they are very, very nice people. Truly, they are, and very intelligent.
Those are two leaders in that movement.
Right. And James Randi used to be a musician, a magician, and he'd appear on like The Tonight Show and stuff like that. And Daniel Dennett, and they're all very intelligent and they seem smarter than me. And, you know, that left me kind of hanging. I thought, okay, it is not rational to follow supernatural voices in your head. I admit that. And I can't prove that God exists with some kind of scientific rigor, but I also know something about me. I resonate with that so well, and I'm so happy. Well, I read a book, and I'm ashamed to say I forget the author's name, but she coined a term, religious trauma syndrome.
Mhm.
Religious trauma syndrome, as if it never had a name before. So if you've experienced life in Calvary Temple where you used to listen to secular music and now suddenly you don't because now you're a Christian, and if you've ever gone through that kind of extreme religious faith and indoctrination, it leaves a mark on you. It really does. So finding my way out of that through all those different kinds of associations, and finally just remembering, who the people were that really reached out to me after I'd left Calvary Temple and felt lost at sea. It was the Presbyterian Church. So I went to I went Burke Presbyterian and started attending services there and getting involved with the community and getting to know the people, singing in the choir,
So you
whatever.
found a healthy
Yeah.
home.
And what I discovered is going from this extreme, like, for example, religious affiliation in a place like Calvary, it's assumed that, I don't want to stir up a hornet's nest, but here it goes. It's assumed that you're also a Republican. If you're a Christian, you must be a conservative. So, of course, you're a Republican. And I did, in fact, feel that, okay, that's where, but in a place like this where people probably listen to NPR and they're probably liberal, and to hear their perspective and think, man, I didn't know the half of it. I
It
didn't know,
reminds me of something. And when I was growing up, my dad, one of the jobs that he had was working at the Smithsonian, and he had met this scientist there who was also very religious. And he said, like, well, how is it, do you balance, because my dad's, religious, but how do you balance your belief in religion? They were talking about Genesis and God made the earth in X amount of time, basically in a couple days versus the scientific theories. And I think this guy was a astrophysics physicist,
Right.
and he said religion and science are answering two different questions. And the thing that struck me about that story, and I've really had this experience since and I feel lucky in every church I've been in. There have been Republicans and Democrats, there have been liberal and conservatives. And what I found is it's almost like being on the same boat in the river. If the boat is the church and the river is the journey in your relationship with God. And some people look out the left window and see social issues and other issues like that they're very conservative about. Other people look out the other side of the boat, so we're still on the same river
Yeah.
looking at different sides, and they see the homeless, they see the hurting, and it was very powerful to me, the idea that, faith is not, you can't prioritize what God or what your church has asked you to do, because there are many things that fall on both sides
Yeah.
of the aisle. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that it's important to understand people are complex and they're complicated, and no one truly makes every decision through by means of reason and rationality and or even cognitive experience. There are things that are difficult to place and to quantify and define, and that religion sometimes endeavors to answer them, and maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong. But science is not the opposite of faith. In my estimation, science is a tool. Science is a tool by which we understand and apprehend the universe and its workings. It doesn't it can't explain the feeling somebody has if they pray or if they meditate or if they walk outdoors and feel the earth all around them. Nobody can put that into, consciousness is actually one of the most difficult things to quantify.
Right.
And that's why I don't think it's good to be certain about something if you have enough evidence for it, but even then you can't really embrace certainty. And
Right.
so I guess
So you've
I love
almost
that bumper
moved.
sticker that says I'm a militant atheist, I don't know, or I'm a militant agnostic, I don't know and you don't either. You know?
Because you've
um,
almost, it sounds like you've moved from a space of needing everything to be certain, right? And that's what the pastor gave you,
yeah.
to a place where you're okay with the idea that you don't have all the or
Yeah,
need all the answers.
I can definitely live with my doubts and my questions,
Yeah.
because that's part of the human experience. In fact, it's not a sign of lacking faith or anything. It basically means I'm just curious.
Right. Yeah. That one of the things I wanted to ask you just as we start to wind down is, what message would you have for, the people who were harmed in the church, like those little girls who may have been sexually abused, the people who are still in the church, and maybe even for the broader group of people who have experienced religious trauma or trapped in the middle of some kind of religious trauma?
Hmm. Yeah. There are times when I can think that as a member of Calvary and having doubts and inklings that something was wrong, that I would kind of tamp those down and not listen to them. Or I would see people who had left the church and noticed that they seemed a lot freer and a lot happier than people around me that I had. And while people in evangelical Christianity are taught to listen to a still small voice, I can't help but think you only listen to the still small voice that you're told to listen to. And you don't listen to what's inside and those things that are warning signs that you're in pain and that you need to pay attention to it. So I would say, are you sure you're listening to that still small voice? Because it's been speaking to you for a while, and you have been too afraid to let it talk to you and minister to you and warn you about impending danger.
What do you hope for the victims?
Well, um, I hope that those who come to their aid to help them have their interests at heart and not their own. In other words, I'm glad you came forward with this, because I've been angry with Calvary Temple for a long time, and it's about time that there's like, how about to that young girl who brought those allegations? I'm glad you told me. How can I help you? And so to them, I know that their pain is real and that they've been hurt and that they're being listened to. But when the protests are over and nobody's there, I hope they reach out and find that family or that friendship that they've always truly wanted and
That
needed.
sense of peace and belonging.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this has been an awesome conversation. I wanted to give you a chance before we stop to just sort of share, like for me, one of the interesting things about this, and I know places like Calvary are extremes. There's no doubt that they're extremes, but there's like two things that sort of stand out for me. One is while they are extremes, there are probably many more of them than most people know.
Mhm.
And other people may experience religious trauma that's just as bad and less problematic organizations. And some people may experience religious trauma in different ways. And I want to let you close out on whatever you want, but I'm really curious about like how you got to this point of like health and healing, and I'll just say something, personal that when we first met, and I think you probably agree, but tell me if I'm wrong. You seem very broken. And then
That's
years
right.
later, you didn't seem broken anymore.
So yeah, when about not terribly long before I met you, I was also working with a therapist, and after hearing my story, she said, "You seem lost," and that's exactly how I felt. And so to get from there to here, it was a journey, but the things that helped me were my wife, my family, my community, and reaching out to other people. One of the hallmarks of, if you want to call it religious trauma syndrome, and I happen to think that that's an apt title, that feeling of I've been through something that no one else has been through and nobody understands. Well, I'm here to tell you a lot of people have been through what you have, and they do understand, and they need you and you need them. I don't think I got through these things alone. I think of those Presbyterian ministers that I was a member of who told me, you didn't know the half of it. Actually, Calvary Temple was even worse than you know, and here's why. And here are facts that prove it. That helped me immensely to meet people who had been through trials and who could also help me. I didn't recover by myself. I wasn't alone, and you won't recover by yourself. You need friends. You need a group. You need therapy, and don't be ashamed of any of those things. You need those things, and they will help, and you will heal, even if it takes a long time.
Wow. All right, Greg, thanks for all of that. This
Yeah,
is like
thank
a
you, Jayson. I
powerful.
appreciate it.
Yeah, from my recent episode that, religion and belonging and sense of community are hugely important to me. And one of the things that I can say about this conversation is that I find when I think of my difficult moments, whether it has to do with religion or mental health or other things, I do think of you often and how inspiring you are to me, just given everything that you've been through, that you've gotten to a place, and I know every day is not perfect, but you've
Yeah.
gotten to a place where you've found some sense of peace and wholeness is a reminder sometimes that whatever I'm going through.
Uh, I
Yeah.
really
So,
appreciate you saying that. One thing I have tried to learn over the years is that I'm definitely an introvert, if nothing else, and that's great. It helps me see the world a much different way than most people do. But one thing that I have come to understand, and I think it comes from my life as a faith, as a person of faith, as a Christian, as a religious person, is that you need to make yourself available, because you don't know how much your story means to someone else, or your testimony means to someone, or just being there. Oh man, I'm so glad Greg's here,
yeah.
and not having any idea why.
Sometimes it's just your ears.
Yeah, sometimes you're there to listen, and sometimes you're there to speak, and sometimes you're there to be silent. But you need to be there. You need to
Right.
you need to let your life become a part of someone else's.
This is Jayson Blair, and this is the Silver Linings Handbook Podcast. We'll see you all again next week.